Welcome to Stories We Love. Stories We Love is about stories we love, and this show is bringing you extraordinary people who are doing really wonderful things for the planet, for children, for creatures, for the environment, lots of really cool stuff. So thank you so much for tuning in. And this show is meant to open your heart, inspire you, and make you feel good, and also maybe help you think of new things that you can do to make this world even more fun and more joyful. My name is Karen Laurie, and today I want to welcome Dr. Eric Lewis. Eric Lewis is doing so many cool things for the environment. So first, you were telling me about the kelp. Talk to us about the situation with the kelp and how you and your team have figured out how to benefit it.
Well, as everybody knows, the climate is going through dramatic changes. And evolution usually allows the changes to change with the different environmental changes. But in this case, the change has been so rapid that environments like kelp cannot keep up with the changing environments. The temperature, the pollution, the acidity, and the predation have overwhelmed kelp forests to a point where we've lost about 94% of California kelp beds. Well, California is very important because it has the largest kelp beds in the entire world.
Oh, I didn't know that. Wow.
And when we see the loss of the kelp, you say, well, that's just a plant. The important thing to remember is kelp is the lowest rung of the food chain. It is the basis of the entire ecosystem. And when you lose 94% of the kelp, you're losing 94% of the entire ecosystem. So this is a big deal. It represents one of many environments that are going through similar changes around the world. And some of our technology companies are designed and focused on solving some of these major problems.
So what are you doing with the kelp that's going to help the kelp come back? And sorry, let me ask you one more question. Sorry. So the other question is, doesn't kelp contribute a lot to our oxygen?
Kelp is the basis. 70% of our oxygen on Earth that we're breathing comes from the ocean. A huge part of that, now, huge part of it is phytoplankton out in the ocean, but another huge part is kelp and grasslands along the coast. And for every acre of healthy kelp, it consumes more CO2 than 35 acres of the healthy Amazon rainforest. The ratio is 35-1 in favor of kelp. So when you're consuming carbon dioxide, you're also releasing more oxygen. So you're right in that the ocean is essential for us to live.
Yes. So then, okay, that sets the stage a little better. So what exactly does your technology company or companies, what are they doing to make the kelp happier and healthier?
Well, as with all of the different technology companies, we basically look at the problem and say, what is causing 94% of the kelp to be gone? And as we just talked about, that includes pollution, temperature, acidification of the ocean, and predation, which includes sea urchins. So here we have this diminishing kelp forest, and it is being lost even as we speak. So how do we take care of it? Is we need to speed up evolution. Speed up evolution without changing any DNA. We don't want to be manipulating DNA to solve problems, because you don't know what is going to end up with the end result. So what we do is, how the heck do we speed up evolution using Darwinian evolution? And that is as we in our labs go ahead and change the environment. We breed the kelp and increase the temperature, acidity, predation, and pollution to equal that of the ocean. So we're building up a resistance to the kelp, to the changing environment, much faster than what it can do naturally. So this is an important concept, that right now the changing environment is changing to such a speed that it cannot be compensated by normal evolution.
Right, that makes total sense. And so when you say you are accelerating evolution, what you're actually doing is you're finding the kelp that is the most resilient in those kind of environments: pollution, acidic, warm temperature, the other things you said. You're finding the kelp that goes, hey, I can handle this. And then you're breeding those kelp.
So when we breed the kelp, we go ahead and put them into an environment that's relatively toxic to them.
Right.
And only a few of the hundreds of thousands will survive. But those are the ones that we will continue to breed. And then we will go ahead, take those offspring and put them in even harsher conditions, so that we can go ahead in a short period of time, go ahead and have offspring without DNA manipulation that can tolerate the increasing temperature, acidity, pollution, and predation. So this is really important to be able to reforest, the coast. And by doing that, what we actually do is, our efforts are to try to increase the harshness to a point where, as we put in our kelp into the ocean, this is lower pollution temperature than they're now accustomed to. And so as the temperature increases, our kelp plants will still thrive.
I love that. That's kind of like athletic thinking. Somebody trains super, super hard, and then what they're doing, their sport becomes much easier because they're so strong and they're so fit. And so you're making athletic kelp. I love that.
Yeah, no, exactly right. That will tolerate these horrible, horrible environments. And we are ready, though we have not started, to do the same thing in coral reefs. And this is really important also, because when you look at what's happening in coral reefs, and this is getting a lot of publicity, probably more publicity than kelp, where you have the Great Barrier Reef losing 70 to 75% of its total coral reef. This is something that right now, a lot of our institutions are breeding the kelp that is already evolved to withstand these conditions. So there may be 5 or 10 of the 440 coral reef species that have been able to withstand these temperature, pollution, predation, and acidity problems. And they breed those to put those back into the ocean. Well, that is speeding up the destruction of the coral reefs, because what they're doing is they're increasing coral volume, but they're decreasing the diversity. You have an environment that has 440 species of coral,
Right.
and you're substituting it for 10 species of coral, those 10 species will literally crowd out the other 430 species to a point where you no longer have an ecosystem.
So what are you doing then for the coral reefs? And I want to go back to the kelp after this because I still have more questions on the kelp, but tell me
Yeah,
what
but they all interdigitate.
okay.
We're having problems with all of our different ecosystems, and this is, these are just examples of the totality of the changing environment due to global warming. And so what we need to do, and we haven't started yet, but we have the facility to do it, is go ahead and breed all 440 species, and just like we did with the kelp, increase the harshness of the environment for all 440 to a point where it equals or is in excess of the environment that is there presently. So when we introduce the 440 rather than 10 species, we will put them back into that ecosystem in proportion to what a healthy ecosystem of coral reef in that area dictates. So it's balancing. It's not just filling, say, the Great Barrier Reef with coral and thinking, gosh, we're doing a great job. And this is kind of what's happening right now. It's kind of the easy way. Say, if we put more coral into, the Amazon or the Great Barrier Reef, we're going to be able to, because it's resistant, it'll be hardy, and it can withstand all these changing environments, we'll be in good shape. And in reality, it's actually speeding up the destruction of the balance of the coral reef ecosystem.
Right. And you see that like with trees, if you look in a natural area, maybe not the redwoods, but like most places where there's a forest or a jungle or a rainforest, having been in lots of rainforests, you see there's a palm tree, there's an orchid, there's a fern, there's like such a diversity, and that biodiversity is coming up more and more. It's something we need to include more and more in our human interactions, that everybody belongs, everybody's important. You can't remove a group of people or of coral or of tree, that everybody is so important. And I love that you're taking into account the diversity and and then finding the balance, because that balance, it's so important. And mimicking nature seems to be like the path I've found. I mean, nature is just such a great teacher.
That's what I tell all of our scientists, is when there's confusion, what I say is, look how nature does it.
Right.
Nature's been in business for between 4 and 5 billion years. They have worked out this evolutionary process. Now, right now, we are overwhelming the normal evolutionary process. But in general, looking at how nature does it to try to get back to that equilibrium is the key part of science. This is a key part of what our company is all about.
I love what
That's
you're
true
doing.
for many of the different companies. It's, again, problem to solution oriented.
Mm-hmm.
So that we go ahead and include this in all of our technology, trying to improve it in not radical, but in a slow way of speeding up, slow to speed up evolution.
Well, that's just like sex.
Yeah, I guess.
You go there, but just that's so obvious, right? Slow to speed up is good with almost everything in a way.
You don't rush into it And the easy way would be to just breed up those 10 resistant coral and have a whole forest of 10 coral plants. But the ecosystem, 25% of all fish species happen in the Great Barrier Reef, 25%. And they're based on those 440 different species of coral.
Right, because every fish has its own little hangout spot it wants to hang out, or every school of fish or pod of dolphins or whatever, they want to hang out there. Oh, I've been in the Great Barrier Reef. There's some crazy kind of fish down there, and giant clams that go,
Yeah.
that swallow me up, and a Maori wrasse that's so big its mouth was like the size of a front of a car. Anyway,
Well, and that's exactly right, but they all fit.
they all fit.
Every one of those species fits.
Yes.
And as we lose our species, and right now, in the last 100 years, we have lost more species than any 100-year period in the last 65 million years since the asteroid, hit the Earth 65 million years ago. So to have people say, well, it's just a few species, we have lost so many that it is already teetering on collapsing in some situations.
We're going to find those species. We're going to bring them back if we can.
No, that may happen, but that's
because
kind
there's
of
almost always
way.
they go hide out. They go, oh, we don't want to hang
the-
out with those people.
Kind of the hard way to do it is to try to revive a patient rather than making that patient healthy from the beginning.
Hello. I love that you're a doctor and you know this stuff. So tell me like what you're doing. So you're breeding the hardiest kelp plants, and then tell me what the whole process involves.
So you go ahead and you go ahead, take the sporophytes, and then you do what's called cast spawning. So you go ahead, and that's how nature, again, how do we do it? You do it the way nature does it. And what that does is you do it in the harshest of conditions. For instance, when you go ahead and breed those kelp in the time period that nature breeds. And then you go ahead and you cast them, and they will follow the natural current. And what ends up happening, which is kind of interesting, as the coral builds up, they will form their natural barrier to the winter storms, that by having kelp, kind of grow in what I call a torpedo-like shape, it deflects the winter storms over the kelp forest and around the kelp forest, so that you don't have tremendous amounts of force going through the kelp forest. Because when you have the water current going through the kelp forest, then there is this shear force that shreds the kelp. And then you basically, as you lose kelp plants, that promotes more kelp loss. This 94% would be maybe more efficient if it was all that 6% left over was concentrated in one area, because you could go ahead and expect more breeding because all the kelp plants are right there, rather than one being 5 miles this way and another one being 5 miles that way, and expect them to breed. Not likely. So you go ahead, and as we cast spawn, we develop this shape of the kelp forest, so that as it grows, it will become what nature has intended it to be. And so that is, so it's not just increasing the resistance to the changing environment, but it is also going ahead and letting nature take over for basically we help nature, but nature is the best way to compensate.
Because nature has so much brilliance. I mean, like, can I just to figure out, like, oh, one sex cell from mom, one sex cell from dad. We all have trillions, 70, 50, 80, however many trillion of differentiated cells, or one acorn and you make a giant tree. Nature has so much brilliance. And I love that you're looking at, and you keep touching your head almost every time you say nature. So I'm guessing that you're kind of tuning to the mind of nature, if you will, that you're
Exactly.
trying to understand the way nature susses things out. And when you're talking about casting, tell me if this is correct, because I've seen it scuba diving, but I'm not sure if that's what I'm seeing, if what you're saying is what I'm seeing. It looks like casting, like it's like all the kelp things open up and all these like little baby kelp are flying all over the place. Is that what casting is?
Exactly. And
Okay.
but we're doing it from the sporophytes that we form ourselves in our lab to make it more resistant.
Right.
We cast them so that nature then can take those sporophytes and then form their natural form of defense against winter storms. You know, a lot of times there were many efforts in the past to grow kelp, and it's part of what we do is grow kelp on little tiles. And this is good for in-lab, work. But what happens is then you have to go ahead and take the little tiles with the kelp plant growing from it, and then you go down and secure it, by scuba diving, secure it on the ocean floor. Well, that is very difficult to plant one kelp plant, every how many divers does it take over how many years to be able to do anything more than a few acres? A lot. It's impossible.
I volunteer.
Use nature to help nature solve its problems.
So tell me how you're doing that with planting them. How do you use the nature?
Well, you again cast spawn, and they will go ahead and find their natural little nooks and crannies that they would grow on. And maybe if you cast 1,000, you would have maybe one or two finding that spot, that perfect spot to grow. But when you're casting out millions, that's okay to have, a smaller percent be able to latch on and grow.
So you're casting, you look at the kelp and you know when it's ready to give birth, if you will, or ready to cast. And that's when you take it out to the ocean and let it do its own glory there.
Well, no, we go ahead and take the sporophytes themselves after they have released in the lab, and then we release them in the ocean.
Oh, okay, that makes sense.
So we let them do it rather than taking plants and holding them in the ocean and say, okay, spawn.
Okay.
No, that's a little less efficient.
Right.
But the problem right now, and the problem that everybody is having, we are working with, several institutions. And the problem that we're having is actually trying to get the permits to do this, to basically help nature. So in our experience, that process takes years and years.
The permits?
With many, many different agencies, and even using the universities, the settings in the universities. And you think, okay, this will give us some leverage, and they will let us, start helping nature. It just takes forever to do that. So we're using some of our facilities down in Baja, which is part of the natural ecosystem of kelp, to go ahead and do a huge part of our work. In fact, we don't do any work up here because it's impossible to be able to fight the bureaucracy that it takes to help nature.
What about
it's kind of interesting to have Mexico being in many ways more advantageous to help nature than the United States because of the bureaucracy.
And especially than California. I mean,
Yep, where California is, the center for environmental studies.
right.
You'd think that they would say, "Oh my gosh, we've got to, fast track this and make this happen." But in effect, it's stand in line like everybody else. Don't start, giving, don't start toting, high and mighty types of things, and that's really a shame because, it's like the rest of our mentality. We are such a reactive society that, for instance, we really don't have a drought as long as the faucet turns on. Hey, I'm still getting water, so we don't have a drought. Well, we're kind of in a mess right now, and we're saying, oh my gosh, all of our reservoirs are gone. So all of a sudden it's like, oh, we've got to slam, in every which way, rather than planning ahead, which we are not very good at.
yes.
And that's why a group of my companies is really focused on the future and solving problems before they happen.
I love that so much. So you're doing it in Mexico. How far north does the kelp go? Does it go all the way up past California or just in California?
Yeah, Oregon, it goes even all the way up to Alaska.
Why don't we talk to those states too? Maybe they'd be better than the bureaucracy here. And I'm
Yeah,
good at,
but this is the natural breeding. So further north, they don't have as much. But from last I spoke to our scientists up in Canada, they've lost 66% of their kelp forest. 33% left is certainly better than our 6% that we have in California. And that is a big part of that is because, they have cooler water temperatures.
Right.
But it's gonna warm up there too.
So, and the other thing you mentioned once about kelp is that kelp sequesters heavy metals. Am I recalling that correctly? Can you talk about that a little bit?
The beautiful thing with that. So you can think of the first step of breeding kelp is to have it survive.
Right.
And once you do that, then it becomes a tool. The tool is, how do we clean up the ocean? How do we clean up that pollution? As you know, eating a lot of predatory fish in the ocean has high levels of mercury. Yet when you measure mercury in the ocean, it's just this much mercury. How do we get that mercury when it's concentrated at such a low concentration? I've been told that Santa Monica Bay has about 3 trillion gallons of water, and the pollution of 1 gallon out of 3 trillion gallons of mercury creates total pollution in that environment. How do we get 1 gallon of mercury out of 3 trillion gallons? Let me answer that.
Yeah, I'm excited.
And our way of doing it is using nature. Again, nature. Using nature, which naturally absorbs heavy metals, and you're exactly right, it does. And it's unfortunately part of the reason that it becomes part of predatory fish, because remember, kelp is the lowest rung of the food chain.
Right.
Sea urchins, abalone, eat the kelp that get eaten by all the way up, to salmon, to sharks, and so forth. And they have the highest concentration because they can't get rid of the mercury. So once they absorb, even a little bit of mercury, it's in their system forever. And then when we eat that salmon, we're actually consuming that mercury and other heavy metals. So the goal is, how do we collect a very small concentration of mercury in a huge environment? And we do that by taking this kelp that we have bred to be resistant and then grows naturally, and then breed it again towards increasing the absorption of heavy metals. We can also, in less concentrated areas of heavy metals, we can breed that same kelp without changing DNA. We can change that. We can go ahead and breed that kelp to be more nutritious, to increase calcium. Did you realize kelp is the healthiest vegetation on the planet? It has more calcium than milk, more vitamin C than oranges, more protein than soy.
Wow.
And we can actually see, as we build up our platform of resistant kelp, we will then be able to use that to go ahead and really help society clean up the pollution, to make the kelp even more nutritious, because the solution to feeding the world is not going to come from land. It's going to come from the ocean.
Interesting.
And kelp is going to be a huge part of that. I mean, kelp is such an essential. I wrote an article about the MBT, which is our company, Marine Biology and Environmental Technologies is the name of the parent company. I wrote an article about MBET's solution for global warming. A center part of that is kelp. And the reason it's so important is because it works on both sides of the global warming equation. What is the global warming equation? It's high levels of CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide. CO2 from our carbon burning power plants, automobiles, and so forth. Methane for domesticated animals.
And humans and undomesticated animals.
Absolutely. And the nitrous oxide, which is the third most powerful greenhouse gas, is from our fertilizers that we're planting for land-based crops.
Right.
So if we can switch from land-based crops, we can decrease the amount of methane that is producing by our herded animals. We can decrease the fertilizer that we're using to grow our vegetation that we eat. And so that's the decrease in production. And so we can, by switching to a ocean-based, a marine diet that includes fish that now has purer water, and so it is healthier fish, by taking out the heavy metals and eating the vegetation, including kelp, including grasses, the sea grasses, we can totally decrease the amount of production. The second half of that equation is consumption. Consumption of CO2. So in this world, as you just open up newspaper after newspaper, you see the production of CO2 in the form of coal burning power plants, in the form of forests being burnt all of that wood that goes up in smoke, that's carbon release that was once stored.
Right.
The permafrost that now is being basically released, the methane in the permafrost because of global warming is now being released. And as that all happens, of course, this is an exponential change. And this is what we're seeing in global warming, because as you warm up the permafrost releasing methane, you speed up the temperature increase, which of course is going to defrost more permafrost.
Right.
And increase fires and increase the destruction of kelp. So kelp, as we just talked about, consumes 35% more CO2 than 1 acre per 1 acre of a healthy Amazon rainforest.
Right. But we still want the rainforests.
Oh, we have to have, but
Yeah.
unfortunately, it's being destroyed
I know.
because replacing it with farmland, and that's just such a tragedy.
Yeah. And one of the things I was listening to this really kind of brilliant Australian scientist, and he was talking about how to also get rid of CO2 and methane. And he said basically biodiverse soil,
Oh, absolutely.
growing natural grasses. And then even if you have ruminants, something from the photosynthesis that goes to the native grasses ameliorates 100 times more methane than a ruminant can make. And I was like, oh my God. And he said, do you want to fix bridges like the California bridge that went down when the rains came? He said, or do you want to fix the soil? So I think there's both. You can have a C thing, but if you have a healthy organic soil, it's a totally different game.
If anyone has not already seen Kiss the Ground, the documentary, I highly recommend it, because regenerative farming, which is what I do in my farms, is essential. In fact, we're right now shipping goats out to our farm to basically eat the weeds, poop, and basically increase the grass production.
Right.
And it's based on one of our members, Stefan Erickson's book on regenerative farming.
Yeah.
And I recommend it's a fantastic read. Unfortunately, we just lost Stefan about 2 months ago. And but he became part of our company because of just what you're saying, which is tying in land-based conservation and ocean-based conservation in increasing the consumption of CO2 from the air.
CO2 and methane.
You're exactly right.
CO2 and methane. And then when you're not using the conventional pesticides and fertilizers, you're not going to get the runoff, because the soil is going to be healthier. So you don't get the runoff that goes into the ocean that makes them more acidity. You don't get as much nitric oxide. And when you're having the native grasses, it's going to make the soil even healthier. So it's just like this whole thing. So it's kind of similar to what you're doing, but on land.
Regenerative farming. And it's what we do on land also. One of our projects is working with a plant called Jotropha. And Jotropha is one of those unique plants that we're using in context. We're using it, experimenting with it to reverse desert expansion at the price of farmland. So Jotropha is native to the wastelands of Baja. Jotropha cinerea is the native Jotropha to the wasteland, and we're breeding it with Jotropha circus, and we're developing larger, taller Jotropha plants. But the key thing with Jotropha is that it not only by increasing the height of the Jotropha, we can actually change the climate, increasing rainfall in these areas, just as removing trees decreases the rainfall.
Right.
You reverse that, but most importantly, the Jotropha takes nitrogen from the air and fertilizes the soil.
I love it.
So it's what's called a nitrogen fixing plant.
Right.
So part of this whole regenerative farming is actually reversing, the global expansion due to global warming, global expansion of deserts due to global warming.
Yeah, and the regenerative farming, it mimics nature. It's bringing the biodiversity back into the soil and recreating the probiotics and the amino acids and the minerals in the soil. And then when one of the people I interviewed was on this show is a regenerative farmer
Great.
in San Juan Capistrano, and he said that if you have healthy soil and it's watered enough and you've got native grasses mixed in and a biodiversity of plants that you're planting, he said you won't have pests. Pests are a symptom of soil imbalance.
Well, the pests will still be there,
but they won't.
What will happen is that it's part of nature. Right. It's like us using antibiotics. We have a natural defensive mechanism in human beings that's based on a balance of bacteria and viruses that protect us. All of a sudden, we change that environment, for instance, using antibiotics, and all of a sudden, that natural defense is lost, and we increase the chance of infection. Well, same thing happens in nature. You go ahead and kill the natural vegetation, the natural flora, and all of a sudden, certain types of pests, that's why they're called pests, overbreed. And what do they eat? They eat the crops. Right. Because there's no, natural flora. The natural flora builds up insect that will kill many of the pests that now are eating their crops.
Right.
So it's reversing that mentality of, gosh, humans have got to kill every insect that we have. Otherwise, they're going to eat my corn. No, now what is really exciting for me is to see farmers like vineyards not disking between their vines, but letting the natural flora build up so that the nature building up with a diverse insect population can kill off the pests that thrive when you destroy natural vegetation. Yeah. And of course, the pests only have one thing to eat, and that's the crop that you're growing.
Right.
So if you remove everything else that normal insects would eat that would defend your crop, then you wouldn't have the problem of quote pests. They would be good insects, just like we have good bacteria in our system.
Yeah. And then, this is so cool. I love what you're doing with the kelp. Where are you in that process? You've done it in Baja?
We've done it in Baja. We're now looking at actually working on ways, and we're working with some scientists from local universities here in Southern California on being able to grow it further out than the normal 200 to 300 feet. That is the maximum depth of water that kelp normally grows in. So we're working on types of infrastructure that can be connected to the ocean floor that we can go ahead and grow all the way out. The ideal would be to be able to grow out the entire 200 miles of California coast and grow it thoroughly so that we could have enough of the kelp ecosystem that we could really change the world.
Yeah, that feels really exciting. But what about things like dolphins? Do they get caught in the kelp ever, or
No,
do
no,
they
no,
just
no.
swim
They,
out?
they go right through it. They go right through it. This is not something that's a net.
Right.
So, one of the things that we haven't even mentioned is kelp as a biofuel.
Right. Talk about that because you're doing that.
It's very exciting. More recently, in the last 10 years, up in the San Francisco area, they've developed enzymatic reactions that can cost effectively take kelp and produce a very effective biofuel, both ethanol and a type of biofuel that can be added to gasoline to decrease the production of carbon dioxide in gasoline. This kelp biofuel can this is what this solution is for global warming, which is we need to replace coal with kelp biofuel, because kelp biofuel will decrease the production of CO2 in these power plants by 75%. To think that every household in the world is going to have a Tesla and a solar panel is really is far-fetched. It's not going to happen, because the infrastructure for power right now is through these power plants. And if we have a power source instead of coal, kelp biofuel, that can decrease CO2 production in those power plants by 75%, then we're well on our way to decreasing the production of CO2. And in gasoline, it'll decrease the production of CO2 by combining with kelp biofuel in higher concentrations, up to 50% decrease in CO2 production in cars too. And
Wow.
cars and power plants are the two main sources of CO2 production, which is the number one greenhouse gases. And as you've mentioned, and I think I've reinforced, is methane and nitrous oxide are the other two that can be mitigated by using a dietary change to ocean diet.
Yeah. So if someone was going to use kelp as a biofuel, are they not going to diminish the kelp more?
Well, see, that's a beautiful thing with kelp, is kelp grows 1 to 3 feet a day. A day.
Oh my
You can
God.
literally watch kelp grow.
I knew a teenager like that once.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
And so why does kelp have 35 times the absorptive power of as the Amazon rainforest? Is because of this rapid growth.
Wow.
Well, so by harvesting kelp, you actually stimulate its production. So you can literally harvest, 12 feet of kelp. If we were to plant the entire coast, the ocean water in front of California, and this is staggering, and I've got the equations to show it, we can replace all fossil fuels that we're using today in the world. Harvesting just the kelp in California, 200 miles out, 1,000 miles up the coast, 128 million acres. Having that filled with kelp can completely remove us from oil altogether, and coal and all other fossil fuels. It's staggering, but it's real.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Wow. That
And
is
so
stunning.
that is where the research must be done. And we're working with some of the universities and emphasizing that in this administration that wants to solve global warming, what a better way of doing it than doing it naturally,
Right.
and working on both sides of the equation. In other words, decreasing the production of carbon dioxide, of methane, of nitrous oxide, and increasing the consumption of CO2 is essential to have global warming controlled.
Yeah, that feels really right. This is amazing. I'm thrilled with what you're doing. I'm so thankful. You have how many scientists are you working with?
We're working with we have a little less than 400 board members on the 21 companies and business units, and they're global. So we have them from around the world, and it's the contribution of these from different cultures, from different standpoints. We have artists, we have, writers, we have creative people mixing with our scientists to create this amazing culture that really does think outside the box.
Yeah, that's phenomenal. And again, it's you're bringing in the diversity of culture, the
Key.
diversity of thought. And it's so important to have diversity of thought, diversity of culture, diversity of soil, diversity of the ocean, diversity of coral reefs, diversity of. Is there only one type of kelp, or is there many?
Oh yeah, there are many types of kelp, and they are different. They're in different environmental areas around the world. And so what we do is part of what we do is looking at vegetation in general. And we want to do that same breeding like we just talked about, as far as taking natural plants from each area and speeding up evolution without DNA manipulation, speeding up evolution so that we can compensate for many of the environmental problems in the area. For instance, we looked at a project outside of Beijing, and they have tremendous amounts of pollution in their well water. So we were looking at a project, and unfortunately, the political environment for us to work in China is really difficult. So that project is basically on hold. But the general premise of that project is to go ahead, take well water, and actually funnel it through ponds of natural water plants that are genetically and the selective breeding to increase the consumption of the pollutants, so that when it goes through all the ponds, we will be able to have pure water at the end and biofuel to be used for power. So
from the plants that were in the
from the plants. So as they grow, we'll be harvesting those plants. Now, no plant grows as fast as 1 to 3 feet a day.
Yeah, that's kind of
But
crazy.
all of these plants will be able to be used. We harvest the growth. We take out the concentrated pollutants, and then we use the biofuel for a natural, less polluting type of fuel.
So when you're taking out the pollutants from the kelp, like let's say mercury or something like that, are you chelating it? Like, how do you do that?
Chelating it. That's see, look at how smart you are.
Look at how smart you
are. So you're right. So we chelate that out, but we have it in a concentrated area. Can you imagine trying to chelate out 3 trillion gallons from Santa Monica Bay?
Right.
Possible.
Right.
But if you can concentrate it in kelp plants, or in this instance, the native plants to and around Beijing, then you'll have it in concentrated form, which will be much more effective in drawing it out so that the biofuel is a pure biofuel. And many of these, what we call pollutants, such as mercury, is actually can be reused.
Yeah, so
So
what do you do with it? Because like once you chelate out the heavy metals or mercury or whichever things, because there's arsenic, lead,
and the mercury and the arsenic, where does that come from? It comes from coal burning power plants. So coal burning power plants, part of the pollutants is not just CO2,
right?
mercury, lead, arsenic. And how does it get along the California coast? It's being produced in China. It's being rain brings it down into the ocean, and the Arctic, current,
Right.
the comes around the Pacific, northern Pacific, and down the coast of Alaska, Canada, Washington, and California.
Right.
So that's how these things become so prominent in our ecosystem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's fascinating. And then once you've chelated out those things, where do you put them? Like, do you?
Well, many of them can be used. They're used in industry, but they can be used in a conservative way. Where they become the problem is when they're released out of control from the coal in these coal burning power plants. And so, they have, if you look up the different metals themselves, you will see the uses that are actually valuable uses. But even by concentrating them and pulling them out of the entire ecosystem, we're decreasing the exposure to humans and other animals that normally would be infiltrated with these toxins because they're in the ecosystems themselves.
Yeah.
They go right through the food chain all the way up to predatory, which is mostly what we consume.
Right. Wow. I love how you're addressing this. I love how you're tuning to the mind of nature. You have other things that you're doing also, like with plastic, that I want to talk about, but I don't know. Let me see what time it is. Oh my gosh, it's already been almost an hour. Can I bring you back and talk about the
Sure.
plastic sometime?
Because it's the same principle, and it's using nature to take care of human problems. It's the only way we can compensate. And what I want the audience to be thinking about is how can we take care of our company, Marine Biology and Environmental Technologies, for instance, looks at the great Pacific plastic island as a food source to feed millions of people healthy seafood. I want people to think, how can that be? And that's what we'll talk about next time.
I feel intrigued.
And most people think about, let's pick it up, let's burn it, let's put in chemicals to dissolve it. Do you think that takes care of the problem? Not a chance. It's just making it worse. And understand what's shocking about plastic, which most people don't know, is plastic. There are about 2,000 different types of plastics, but plastic has an affinity for mercury, lead, and arsenic. And 99% of the plastic pollution we cannot even see.
Right.
Only 1%. You see the big plastic, containers and the little tiny plastic, that is all over. All of that combined represents 1% of the total pollution from plastics. 99% is microscopic, can't be seen without a microscope, or nanoscopic, and that means it's in the air we breathe. It's not just in the ocean, it's in everything that we eat, because it gets rained upon in our plants, in our broccoli, in our asparagus. And the nanoplastic and the toxins that are attached to it is what is going to be 20 years from now the single biggest epidemic of cancer we've ever seen.
But you have a solution.
Oh, we're going to solve it. We're going to solve it before it happens.
Thank you. Yeah, don't leave us on a thing where there's no solution, because that wouldn't work. I can't do that.
Now, we
I know
can't
there's
have
a solution to everything. You can't
problem
have-
to solution. That's our total orientation.
Yeah, because you
There is
can't
no
have a
such
problem
thing as
without there being-
can't do.
Right. You can't have a problem without there being a solution.
Right.
Dr. Eric Lewis, thank you so much. I feel elucidated and edified and clearer. And it's so exciting what you're doing. And I think, I love what you were saying about the kelp. I love what you were saying about the coral, even though we didn't talk about that much. But just the consciousness to go, oh, we need that biodiversity in the coral. I just love what you're doing. I thank you so much. I can't wait to talk to you again, because I want to know more about what you're talking about with the plastic, because that sounds very intriguing. And thank you so much. And I appreciate you so much. And thank you,
You're
everybody.
welcome.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for tuning for Stories We Love. I love you, and I'm glad you're here. And let's all get inspired and do something really fun for the world. Thank you so
Love
much.
it. Thank you. Thank Karen.
Thank you so much.